Good morning, I'm Sean Spear, the Project Director at the Ontario 360 Project here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Viewers will know that over the past several weeks we've been releasing policy papers on key issues facing the Ontario government, and today's no different. This morning we released a new paper called Reimagining Ontario's Business Supports that looks at the panoply of policies that Ontario has to try to attract businesses and investment to the province, and how it can design those programs to be more effective. The paper was produced by me and my co-author, Jamison Steeve, who amongst other things is a faculty member here at the Munk School. And we're hoping that the paper will ultimately help to inform and shape efforts underway by the Ontario government to redesign the business support programs that they've inherited from their predecessors. Jamison, thanks for joining me, and thanks for your important contribution to the paper. Let's just start by describing for viewers what are business supports and why do we have them, and what does the evidence tell us about their effectiveness?
So business supports, in a nutshell, there are 3 or 4 tools that people think of as business supports. One is tax incentives, the second is direct financial support, and the third is in-kind supports, which could be land or otherwise. They're usually trying to achieve 2 key goals. One is general economic growth, and the second is support for firms, regions, or sectors of the economy. To your last question, are they working? I think both of us were surprised to find across the range of political spectrum, time, all spectrums, there doesn't seem to be a lot of support, academic, intellectual, or otherwise, that these supports actually derive the benefits that they are claiming to bring to society on the first instance.
It's pretty extraordinary, isn't it? The Ontario government, depending on the measure you use, spends approximately $5 billion per year on these types of business support programs, and they're hardly alone. Governments across the country and elsewhere in the world use similar types of programs. And yet, notwithstanding this significant expense, the evidence seems to tell us that on balance, these types of programs don't meet a typical cost-benefit analysis. What, given all of that, why do governments, including the Ontario government, continue to implement these types of policies?
Yeah, it's a great example of, here at the school we try to teach about evidence-based policy, and I teach a course on politics and policy. This is literally a great example for it, where the evidence doesn't support the policy initiative. I think there's a couple reasons. One is, as you mentioned, there's a bit of a Cold War going on. If every jurisdiction has these tools or weapons of economic creation, you don't want to be the one that puts them down, because what if they are working and it's a talking point to a certain extent. The second one is, intuitively, it feels like they make sense. Mm-hmm. If a company is coming to the jurisdiction, if I can offer them something, here comes the Godfather offer of land or tax incentive or otherwise, then they will come. That's a benefit that I can show that I've created jobs and economic growth. And lastly, and maybe this is a transition to some of our other recommendations, it does feel like a tool from an economy past. Mm-hmm. When we were trying to draw economic actors who had large or high fixed costs, these types of programs at least intuitively made some sense. I can reduce your cost of capital, of investment in manufacturing facilities. But now, as the economy is changing, perhaps that equation no longer exists.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like, as we released this paper here in November 2019, that there is some rethinking going on, not just here in Ontario, where the government has announced its intentions to revisit and redesign some of the business support programs, but really globally. You observed in your presentation today that the experience in and around the second Amazon headquarters seems to have been a catalyst for this type of rethinking. Do you mind just elaborating on that?
No, not at all. Yeah, it was, so my thinking on business supports and the Amazon HQ2 decision in particular were really educated by Richard Florida, a former colleague. So Richard was on the advisory board of, I think, Invest Toronto at the time, who was putting together the bid book. And he basically had to resign because he felt he couldn't in good conscience participate in a process that might at the end advocate for business supports, because he thought it was asinine. That at the end of the day, he saw a large global company asking relatively poor public actors to provide incentives to come to their jurisdiction. So some 200 cities bid on Amazon HQ2. It was down to 20 at the end, of which Toronto, in a very Canadian way, was incredibly happy to be on the final 20 list. But we were also very proud that we were one of the few that offered no business supports or public incentives. We basically said, great land, great people, great society, come here. At the end of the day, over $2 billion worth of tax incentives, over $50 million worth of direct financial supports, and then other in-kind supports came from Arlington, Virginia, and Queens, New York, selected as the 2 locations. And then protests erupted in Queens. And it was a really interesting example of where at the start of the process, everyone's on board, there's a parade coming, we want to get to the front of it, and we're willing to pay almost any public price for it by the end, and maybe in particular because it's an Amazon or a tech company, but there's a general acceptance that maybe isn't the best way to spend a public dollar to subsidize a private company. You can see it again at Calgary on whether you should fund a hockey arena. Here in Toronto, the Sidewalk Labs discussion. So I think there's a growing sense in the public sentiment that is this an effective or appropriate use of public dollars?
Yeah, it's a great point. And it's against that backdrop that now the Ontario government is conducting this review of its business supports framework. Before we get into the recommendations, it's just worth observing, or at least recognizing, that policymakers at times feel like they're stuck in a conundrum. The evidence, as you say, points to the limitations of business supports in terms of attracting and retaining business investment. But at the same time, other jurisdictions are pleased to step up with the proverbial novelty check. So how should Ontario policymakers think about this tension that on one hand, the evidence doesn't provide much basis for these types of programs. On the other hand, they feel squeezed by other jurisdictions that are too willing to play this game.
I think that's why I like the title of the paper so much. We're asking them to reimagine. And so I think it's a 2-step process. The first is recognizing you're in that box and try to make those decisions A, smarter, and B, as consciously as possible. So kudos to the current government on trying to modify their regional economic development strategies and also shutting down the past program, the Jobs and Prosperity Fund, which would, I think, arguably be almost the poster child for funds of this type that don't meet the goal for which they were intended. But then secondly, start to make some policy choices around maybe place-based or sector-based where you see a challenge for either a region or a sector of the economy that you deem valuable in some way, shape, or form, whether that is social cohesion, economic cohesion, or building off of a strength, as we say in the paper, around manufacturing. So I think it's going to be a slow process to get off of the drug of business supports, but I think we've offered up a remedy to do so.
So if we could just talk for a minute then about some of the insights or prescriptions in the paper. You mentioned earlier that the typical objectives for these types of programs are first, enhancing efficiency, and second, supporting a firm or a sector or a region. I think the paper, drawing on the existing literature, says that on balance, these types of programs aren't very effective at advancing the first objective. But do you want to talk a bit about your thinking with respect to the second? I think in your presentation you said, if we stop thinking of these programs on efficiency grounds and started thinking about along equity grounds, there may actually be more of a justification for them, and that's part of this process of reimagination, I think, that you're describing.
Yeah, absolutely. So the example that I used in my presentation today was the supercluster initiative from the federal government, where their 2 efficiency goals are 50,000 jobs and a $50 billion increase in GDP. Those are really hard to achieve. Even if you do achieve them, it is, very difficult to draw a direct line between a public investment and that growth. So those are 2 really hard hills to climb, and I would argue not intelligent hills to die on.
Yes.
And so, but if you shift those to say, we want to make sure that there are areas of the province or sectors of the economy that we want to hold on to, that we want to make sure continue to grow in some way, shape, or form, that absent intervention, so let's argue it's a market failure, absent government intervention or public sector intervention, are going to go away or not participate in some way, shape, or form. So if that's on the equity side, that the knowledge economy growing in the Kitchener-Waterloo corridor, in Toronto, in Ottawa, great. we don't want to, we're two small town guys from Ontario. I don't want all of the graduates from my high school in St. Catharines to say, my only hope for economic growth is to move out of town.
Yes.
What do I do policy-wise to create the conditions in which they might actually want to stay home? Northern Ontario,
yes.
Certain parts of Eastern Ontario, rural Ontario. So I think there's an equity aspect that is kind of counterintuitive. Equity language in a business or economic development program doesn't necessarily intuitively make sense, which I think is the value of the paper. We need to reconstitute how we think about these programs and at least be honest.
Yes.
If I'm the Auditor General, measuring a program's advancements on equity would have been an interesting task versus all the efficiency measures where it's really hard to say that there's value for dollar.
Just to stretch that point a bit further, one thing the paper observes is that the government is involved in redistribution between people and places, but that redistribution typically happens after the market's allocation of resources or outcomes. So you think about taxing high income earners and then redistributing it to lower income earners in the form of different programs, or taxing incomes in Toronto and redistributing that to other parts of the province through various mechanisms. I think what the paper observes, which is to your point about reconceptualizing what the objectives are here, is business support programs may be seen in this light as pre-market redistribution. Mm-hmm. That is to say, rather than waiting for the market to produce outcomes and then redistributing those outcomes across different places, it's providing targeted business support programming in places that the market is neglecting in the hope of trying to catalyze market activity. Mm-hmm. And as you say, when seen through that lens, the case for business supports may be stronger. I'm sensitive that we've kept you for a long time, but one thing we try to achieve at the Ontario 360 project is really concrete recommendations. And I think one of the strengths of this paper is it produces this new conceptual framework, but it also has some specific policy prescriptions that incidentally stem from a previous paper that you wrote for the Ontario 360 project. Do you mind just telling viewers a bit about what a different approach for business supports might look like to try to support the manufacturing sector in the province?
So let me broaden it just a little bit. That we offer up 3 recommendations. One is to get your competitive policy framework right. I think you really creatively came up with this challenge to look at closing the 22% gap between the productivity of Ontario versus the United States. Arguably, Ontarians are 22% less rich than others, or poorer, depending on how you want to articulate it. Maybe we can get into that. The second, on the manufacturing side, it has long been looked at in Ontario that is who we are. That is part of our identity. But that manufacturing base is starting to go away. The business supports were intended to be an answer to that, mm-hmm. and we're arguing there's a smarter way to do that. We in the past, at a previous institute, argued for a very similar model of trying to use, and you've argued, out of using the Obama administration's approach to bringing advanced manufacturing and manufacturing units together, and very exciting in a university context, academics, practitioners, government, and others, to try to scale up those activities that are happening on a regional basis, particularly around manufacturing. Those could be directly appointed, those could be through a competitive process. People apply, show that they're working together, very similar to what they did in superclusters, yes. Actually here in the country, to solve at least 2 problems that we see in the Canadian context, particularly in manufacturing. One is a lack of R&D investment. Pooling those resources and reducing the risk might increase the ability for manufacturing to grow. And the second is scale. Yes. We in this country are very good at staying small. And so what can we do to manufacture more size? And those units could be useful in that regard. And then the third recommendation is based on your Opportunity Zones paper, which I think is really meritorious.
Just on the Manufacturing Institute's model that we talk about in the paper, one of the reasons I think we were drawn to that approach is it learns the lessons of some of the past failures of business support programs. And I liked what you said earlier today. It changes the framework from government being a direct funder of individual firms mm-hmm. to being a platform where different firms within a subsector are able to collaborate on R&D issues, on developing supply chain linkages. Do you mind just elaborating on this idea of government as a platform as opposed to a direct funding partner?
It'll be a real change. So I think it is government has some powers, and often when you're a political staff or a public servant, you gravitate towards funding solutions because it's the biggest lever at your disposal. But the ability to convene, the ability to cajole, and the ability to share information are really underutilized public policy tools. And so I see it at least in two ways. One is knowledge sharing. We don't have enough managerial talent in the province, is one of the criticisms that is often levied, and our response policy-wise is give more MBAs.
Yes.
Okay, great. But having some information sharing once people are out in the field, I think would also be beneficial. That would be an ancillary benefit to those types of things. So it is creating the conditions in which unlikely partners are going to come together to learn from each other. And in manufacturing is a great one. Steve Carlisle, who is an auto executive, when he was trying to figure out what was happening in autonomous vehicles in the province, he told me he got in his car with a colleague and started driving around to various universities. That can't possibly be the answer to that problem. These types of institutes could be useful if you wanted to go to an autonomous vehicle institute housed in Ottawa, because that's where a lot of the technology, it's the fallout from RIM. Yes. That would be a wonderful one-stop shop to go to if I were from a business development and investor and otherwise. So I think there are multitudes of benefits to these types of institutes, but that's where I see government as platform. It'll be a change because you could see chambers of commerce also playing a role in that, bringing the necessary players together.
Labor unions?
Absolutely. One of our challenges is we're 13 million people. We're just too small from an economic perspective. I'm trying to think about how do you flip that on its head and say, hey, we're only 13 million people. Yes. These types of institutes can bring our size as an advantage rather than a disadvantage.
Well, thank you so much, Jamison, for your contribution to the paper and your insights today. Viewers who are interested in this model may look to Manufacturing USA, which is this constellation of manufacturing institutes that were created under the Obama administration, in which could serve as a model for the Ontario government as it grapples with how to reconceptualize its business support framework and learn the lessons from the literature and indeed even reports by the Auditor General, the Financial Accountability Office of Ontario, and others who've looked under the hood of Ontario business support programs and have made the case for a new approach. I think as we wait to see what's in the 2020 budget, hopefully the government decides to take a bet on some of the ideas set on this paper. I think if they do, the outcome will be a more transparent, more principle-based, and hopefully ultimately more effective business support framework. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your interest in the project, and stay tuned for our final paper in the 2019 series coming up next week. Thank you very much.